Okay, this is the video for clips 4, 5, and 6, possibly 7. Now, what I want to go through on this is the idea of history, and again, this is the introductory lecture. So I want to take you through what historians and others think history is. Now, for this lecture, what I want you to think about are these three ideas. First, what are the limits of considering the oral traditions recorded in the 19th century as historical documents? What that means is historians and scholars, European explorers in the 19th century, as well as our elders, either gathered or committed the oral traditions that they'd grown up with, that they'd been taught, or that explorers recorded from elders in the 19th century. Those traditions were placed on text. They were written down into documents. And there's huge numbers of documents in the national libraries and in family documents. Now, what you need to consider is, what's the nature of those documents as historical texts? And it's very much like the biblical texts. Can we take the oral traditions as historical documents, or are they something else? So that's the first idea that I want you to think about, particularly with the canoe traditions, because can these canoe traditions be taken as historical texts? The second point is, depending on your answer, what do the oral traditions teach us about history? We think history is about what really happened. Or is it? Is it something different and more than that? And those are really the two ideas. So what I want to do with here is to start with what history is traditionally seen to be. And that's the next clip 5, where I start with the historian Leopold von Ranke, German historian. You don't need to know everything about von Ranke until you're in your postgraduate years. But this is what you need to know, because largely history comes from this period and from this scholar. Von Ranke didn't like the idea of grand speculative theories. Instead, he was concerned with the facts. So his view of history was, you need to understand the facts. You need the facts, and the facts reveal themselves. And from that revelation, so to speak, you have a history. So he was also what we call a documentary positivist, where he believed history was in the documents. Therefore, all you needed to do was to place one document after the other in chronological order, and you'd get a history, because these documents would reveal themselves to be what really happened, or as he said, how it actually was. All right? Now, the effect of that type of thinking you can see right into the 19th century and the early 20th century, and even up into the present with historians now. Historians still believe that history is kind of like, well, some historians still believe that history is kind of like a newspaper event, an article, where the newspaper records what actually happens. We just want the facts. Now, the influence of this type of thinking was evident with two historians in the 19th century, two Pākehā historians. One was called Percy Smith, who wrote Hawaii, the original homeland of the Māori, and with him he had a colleague called Elston Best. Very interesting scholars. They went out into the Māori communities and they gathered information, the oral traditions that they thought were disappearing. Now you see this mistake and this type of history and anthropology being done all the time, even on the documentary channels that we get today. The view is that if these scholars go to these tribal elders, they will get the history as it's been passed down generation after generation to the living person now, who has recorded that information, retained it in their memory, word perfect. And quite often, the interesting thing is with these oral traditions, they are just about word perfect, 90–80% word perfect. So Percy Smith thought he could go to these types of elders, record their histories, oral traditions, and create a history. Right. Note that I make a distinction between oral tradition and history now. Okay. Percy Smith went to the elders, gathered their oral traditions, constructed a history. And that's why I've got the timeline here, because essentially he took the oral traditions and all of the ancestors who are involved in these migrations, And he lined up the genealogies, one ancestor after the other, and he constructed this chronological timetable that you've got now. So Smith was able to say, by allocating each ancestor 25 years, that Māori got to New Zealand in 1350 AD, which is called the Great Fleet. He imagined and he wrote that Māori came from Hawaii in a great fleet to New Zealand. If you trace the timetable, it starts in India 450 years BC, right? And you've got the stepping stones in the timeline there between then and 1350 AD, where they are in Java, BC, 65 years BC, and you'll see the stepping stones. Now that type of history aligns with what's going on in the rest of Europe, where they look to the Bible, and the Bible's seen as a timeline, where in this, the views of this scholar, the Archbishop of Armagh, James Ussher, where he argued that the world was created 4,004 years ago at 9 o'clock in the morning, October the 23rd. How did he do this? By taking the biblical texts and establishing a chronology and a timeline from there. Okay? What you need to think about then is the relationship of the document to history. The reason why I've used the biblical text here is because I'm suggesting it's the same thing. Should Percy Smith have taken these oral traditions and seen them as historical texts, or has he done the same as biblical scholars, and they've taken the Bible and seen it as history? Think about that for this video. End of video.